Lovely. Okay, this is our last paper of the day. So I'd like to introduce Maxime Maleux, who's also from KU Leuven on the Bifrost project. And you're going to be talking to us about Romans for Goths and Copts. So enjoy.
So I hope you're all ready for another presentation today. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you also for granting me the opportunity to share some preliminary results of my research on some various bilingual manuscripts, which is conducted, as Amy said, in the context of the ERC-sponsored Bifrost project. The original title I chose for my abstract was Romans for Goths and Copts, as I plan to include only Gothic and Coptic bilingual texts in my investigation. However, as you might notice, I could not confine myself to these two languages, and also included Arabic and Armenian to amplify the scope of my research. Now, the central question I will address in this talk is what are the premises and limitations of bilinguals as a source for New Testament textual criticism? New Testament textual criticism has traditionally been approached from a largely monolingual perspective, even when versional evidence is considered. The primary focus has remained on individual language traditions and their relationship to the Greek text. However, bilingual manuscripts offer a unique reflection of the multilingual world in which New Testament circulated. And given the material context of these manuscripts, it is reasonable to hypothesize that the versions they contain influenced one another. This raises the question of whether bilingual manuscripts can exhibit textual influence from one language into the other, bypassing Greek as an intermediary. Additionally, could these bilingual versions preserve Greek variants that are either absent or only rarely attested in the Greek monolingual manuscripts? In my talk today, I will first introduce the theoretical framework I adopted for this talk, namely Burton's typology of similarities between the two versions. And next, I will present the corpus of bilingual manuscripts I selected and which passages I use for the comparison of the manuscripts. The main body of the presentation will then consist of two case studies. The first concerns a passage from a Greek-Armenian bilingual that contains a shared reading, while the second case study focuses on a Gothic language, Gothic Latin bilingual manuscripts. We already mentioned Codex Carolinus this morning by Carla Palomini. Finally, I will discuss, of course, the implications of these findings in concluding remarks. A major challenge in assessing contamination in bilinguals is distinguishing between true interlinguistic influence, idiomatic phrasing, and unknown Greek readings. This difficulty necessitates a careful methodological approach, and the typology proposed by Philip Burton in his 2002 contribution on Latin Gothic interaction, which was not specifically focused on bilingual manuscripts, provides a valuable framework as it evaluates which linguistic strategies are most likely to result from language context. First, Burton distinguishes shared readings from shared renderings. While shared readings are unequivocally dependent from an attested or conjectured Greek variant, shared renderings are the product of language contamination independent from the Greek text. Within this category, he identifies further 5 types of correspondences, namely formal correspondence, shared interpretations, patterns of rendering, loan shifts, and under-differentiation. Apart from the formal correspondence, these are found on semantics, which can be particularly difficult to ascertain, especially in small corpus languages like Gothic. Moreover, Burton argues that the formal correspondence is of limited utility, as it may simply reflect a Greek textual variation rather than genuine cross-linguistic interaction. With these caveats in mind, I will analyze now the 2 case studies of interlanguage influence. The first concerns a reading attested in Greek, while the second exemplifies direct linguistic contact between the 2 traditions within one bilingual manuscript. Now, to investigate textual variants and bilingual interactions, I've selected a corpus that is sufficiently extensive to allow for a meaningful analysis while remaining manageable in scope. A comprehensive study of the entire New Testament would, of course, be unfeasible, while limiting the investigation to a small number of test passages would risk losing broader patterns of interaction. Furthermore, most bilingual manuscripts are fragmentary, lacking entire books or sometimes containing only short passages. The corpus for this study is based on a substantial passage from the Epistle to the Romans, and I chose Romans due to its attestation in Codex Carolinus, one of the only two extant Gothic Latin bilingual manuscripts. Since Codex Carolinus is the only Gothic bilingual containing Pauline epistles, the choice of Romans 11:33 to Romans 15:13 was a natural one. And it offers a sufficiently broad yet feasible selection of text for comparison. Coincidentally, all other relevant bilingual traditions include at least one manuscript that preserves this very passage. I transcribed and compared the text across these manuscripts using an Excel file, which will form the basis of a forthcoming article mapping the most salient variants and combinations. For the analysis, I adopted morphological rather than semantic criteria to evaluate the category of formal correspondence as a useful tool to assess interlanguage influence. So yeah, according to received tradition, the Gothic version was translated by the Gothic Arian bishop Wulfila in the 4th century, as has already been mentioned by Carla Palomini this morning, and Wulfila's Greek Vorlage belongs to the Byzantine text type, thus constitutes one of its earliest witnesses. However, there are also some Western readings, along with some contaminations, that have made scholars expect influence from the so-called Vetus Latina translations. While there is no serious doubt about the Greek Vorlage, scholars have debated since the 19th century about the conscious implementation of Old Latin readings by Wulfila or later Gothic scribes. The degree of Latin contamination has been overestimated and underestimated in turns, but the scholarly consensus nowadays accepts at least a sizable degree influence. The linguistic conflict between Latin and Gothic is further highlighted by the existence of the two Gothic bilinguals, which I already mentioned, namely Codex Carolinus, that contains the passage from Romans, Caput Wolfenbüttel, and the Codex Vicensis, containing a passage from the Gospel of Luke, which sadly was destroyed by a flood during World War II. A significant number of bilingual Coptic Arabic manuscripts also exists, primarily in the Bohairic dialect. The Arabic text is not always a direct translation of the Coptic, as in some cases it derives from Syriac or Greek. Additionally, some Arabic manuscripts contain exegetical additions that are not traceable to any known Greek reading or versional tradition. The first manuscript I consulted, Copts 17, kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, contains an Arabic translation from the Coptic, which seems to keep quite close to the facing Coptic version. The second manuscript 166 from the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, contains an Arabic version that is quite distant from the Coptic as it concerns a translation from the Syriac Peshitta with some exegetical expansions. The Coptic itself often deviates from Borner's standard edition, while the Parisian manuscript seems to stick relatively close to it. Then the Armenian translation is said to date from the 5th century and is also praised for its faithful and elegant rendering of the Greek. Some scholars even calling it the Queen of Versions. A massive wealth of manuscripts of this translation have been preserved, but as of yet, no modern critical edition of the text is extant. The standard edition that is used is still the so-called Zohar edition that harks back to the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. Curiously, there is only one single bilingual manuscript that we know of, which features Armenian, namely this Greek Armenian bilingual. In the Greek version, the Greek column is known as GA256. The Armenian text closely aligns with the Zohar edition, but some significant divergences exist. Many of these deviations result from an effort to adhere as closely as possible to the Greek Vorlage, which seems to resemble closely the Greek column manuscript itself. Now on to the first case study. The first study I will now present is a notable, interesting deviation from the Zohar edition, which can be traced back to the Greek column facing. Romans 12:19 in the Greek text reads "Emoi ekdikesis." Mine is a vengeance, mine is a revenge, which is a citation from Deuteronomy 32:35. The Hebrew text has the singular form, nakam, revenge, of which Paul's quotation is thus a literal translation. The Septuagint, on the other hand, seems to have done something completely different. The Armenian translation, however, diverges from the Greek and also from the standard Zohar edition by rendering the phrase in the plural. Mine are the revenges, mine are the vengeances, so to say. In Armenian, im en vreshen duteyunk. The k element on the end is the plural mark. This translation choice is deliberate, as evidenced by also the inclusion of the plural verb form in Armenian, the n, which is they are, despite the Greek construction being elliptical without in the verb of to be. One possible explanation for this reading is an instance of iticism, where the singular ending is could have been misinterpreted as a phonetically identical plural ending eis, pronounced as is in post-classical Greek. However, a shift from plural to singular would be more typical than the reverse. Notably, the plural ekdikesis is attested in some key manuscripts, such as Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, and also you already mentioned Codex Bernerianus. And it won't come as any surprise now that we have heard already the example of iticism in Alex's presentation. That this too presents a clear case of iticism, I would say, which is of course a non-existent form in classical Greek. So yeah, interestingly, the interlinear Latin translation renders the words in the singular, vindictam, as you can see on the somewhat blurry picture. And no Vetus Latina witnesses, to my knowledge, are known to contain a plural form, like vindictae or vindictas. The Armenian translation thus aligns with a rare Greek reading found in a select group of important manuscripts, suggesting that the influence of these Greek variants, even if there are mundane, obvious spelling mistakes, is more extensive than previously assumed. Interestingly, according to the Coptic Scriptorium website, also some Bohairic manuscripts exhibit this plural form. Could these manuscripts perhaps have followed a tradition originating from the Codex Alexandrinus? On the other hand, the bilingual Coptic Arabic manuscripts I examined do not exhibit this form, as both languages unequivocally opt for the singular. Now on to the second case study. As I mentioned earlier, there is some debate about Latin influence in the Gothic translation, and Codex Carolinus provides an ideal test case for assessing this influence. As Falluomini has demonstrated, the Gothic and Latin text of this manuscript exhibit both significant similarities, but also numerous differences, totaling some 22 points of divergence. This indicates that the Latin column is not a mere translation of the Gothic. Instead, the Latin text aligns well with some other Vetus Latina versions of Romans. But nevertheless, some passages exhibit close parallels between the Gothic and the Latin text that cannot be explained by Greek textual evidence alone. A striking example occurs in Romans 14:18, where the Gothic conjugated verb, galike, which means he pleases, translates the Greek adjective, evarestos, pleasing. The Gothic construction here closely mirrors the Latin placet deo, also meaning he pleases God. Whereas a more literal Gothic rendering of evarestos would likely have been the past participle, galikes. This suggests either a deliberate adaptation of the Gothic text under Latin influence. Now let's look at some parallel passages. In Romans 12:1, the same adjective evarestos is used in a very similar context as an adjective to Sion with theo as a dative complement. And the old Latin versions have mostly opted for the translation placentem, an active construction, active participle. The Latin translation could equally have opted for the construction by placet, but this is no attested variant. The Gothic literally follows the Greek with the past participle in the accusative, which is relikedana. One verse later, in Romans 12:2, we encounter the adjective in a series of 3 attributes to the Greek telema. At first sight, the Gothic Haliket seems to be the same form as the one in 1418, as it also reads Haliket. Yet here it clearly concerns also a past participle, just neuter past participle, like ustochan, which means perfect, perfected like de Leon. Interestingly, the Latin version of the Latin column of Codex Perolinus also has a past participle, the somewhat awkward, I would say, bene placitum. Other Vetus Latina manuscripts have placens, which is a more idiomatic active participle. As additional evidence, I point out two more instances of the Gothic equivalent for Evaristos, yet these are not present in our Gothic Latin bilingual. And in fact, they are not well represented in the Vetus Latina corpus. The first instance is Ephesians 5:10, where we encounter again the construction Evariston toi kyrioi, this time depending on the neuter people. The Gothic again has a past participle Haliket toin, with the auxiliary verb sie as the translation of esti. The second instance is Colossians 3:20 with virtually the same construction. All in all, there seems to be enough evidence that the past participle of Haliket, is an idiomatic translation choice for the Greek adjective Evaristos, whereas the Latin of some Vetus Latina versions has to resort to an awkward bene placitum in order to render a calque of the Greek tos adjective. Some Vetus Latina translations opted for the active placens, and in verse 1418, the most natural expression for the Latin would be the finite verb after the relative pronoun, which we see. As such, this pattern would fit in Burton's category of formal correspondences. While it is certainly true that formal correspondences should be treated with utmost care, there are, in my view, cases like this which betray a clear influence in the direction Latin to Gothic, unmediated by the Greek. Firstly, the form Haliket is formally very close to the past participle Halikes, which is an idiomatic rendering of Evaristos, according also to Miller's Gothic grammar. Secondly, the parallel passages confirm this and may perhaps even suggest that the original reading was Haliket, later adjusted to the Latin into Haliket. Curiously, seemingly overlooked, this instance of a calque from Latin may present an extra argument to suppose a revision of the Gothic biblical text in the years after Vulpila's translation, when parts of the epistles at least were subjected to revisions made with old Latin translations in hand. A reflection of this may be seen in the bilingual Codex Carolinus, which could perhaps have been the very place where this contamination has taken place. We'll now come to some final observations. As will be clear by now, bilingual manuscripts are not mere literal renderings of each other, as they undergo influence from traditions beyond their Greek Vorlage or their facing translation. However, their contamination provides insights into variants and their circulation. As the case of the Greek Armenian bilingual has illustrated, there are variants that appear in the one version but are absent from the other column. If this manuscript were studied from a monolingual Greek perspective, ignoring the Armenian, this might have gone unnoticed. The Gothic Latin bilingual case, where a formal correspondence between Gothic and Latin, independent from the Greek Vorlage, can be discerned, suggests that even when the Latin is not a perfect translation of the Gothic, there can still be discerned contamination which has to have originated in a bilingual environment. This case further illustrated the importance of taking formal correspondences into account that must have originated independently from the Greek. Parallel passages are also crucial for assessing influence, and careful study of bilinguals is necessary to chart variant spread and versional derivations from the Greek. Thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Maxime. This was really wonderful. I appreciate your comments on the Gothic and Latin. But also, too, you mentioned just in passing that there was no edition of Pauline epistles in Armenian, but Maleux published in 2021 a volume of Neshmiad's, and I just got my hands on it late last year, so I haven't had a chance to work through it yet. I mean, it's an enormous undertaking. It includes Pauline epistles in the broadest sense, so 3rd Corinthians and Hebrews are in there too. It's certainly not free of error, I think, but it's a really good starting point. So we now need to have a place to from which we can work. So So I want to bring that to your attention.
Thank you very much. Well, what I said about the Zork was about the entire New Testament, about the entire Bible.
Oh, sure.
So
Okay.
that was a bit generalizing, I'm afraid,
I thought
but
you were saying-
no, thank you very much for pointing that out. That's very interesting.
Do you have reference to that, or should I send it to you?
That's, yeah, if you want. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah.
Anything else? No. In that case, then, well, thank you again.
Thank you very much.